The sun bled out across the horizon, painting the vast, unforgiving plains of the west in hues of raw sienna and bruised purple. Dust, fine as milled flour, was the territory's lifeblood and its curse. It coated everything: the scraggly sagebrush that clung stubbornly to the cracked earth, the inside of a man's throat, and the worn leather of a saddle that had seen 1,000 miles of nowhere. This was a land that promised fortune but dealt mostly in hardship, a place where the silence was so profound it felt like a presence, broken only by the mournful cry of a distant coyote or the rhythmic thud of a horse's hooves against the hardpan. In the scattered towns, little more than a muddy street with a general store, a blacksmith, and a saloon. The air was thick with the scent of cheap whiskey, sweat, and the acrid tang of gunpowder that never seemed to wash away. It was a land that swallowed people whole, chewed them up, and spat out either the hardened or the dead. Trapped within the rattling confines of a covered wagon, Eliza felt as if she were already being digested by this desolate country. At 17, her world had shrunk to the size of this cramped, swaying box. The calluses on her hands spoke of a life of mending clothes and pulling weeds, not of the gilded future her parents had imagined for her, but their dreams, like their farm, had withered under a relentless sun. Desperation had been the final crop they harvested, and she was the price. She remembered the day the deal was struck. The man, a land agent for her future husband, hadn't even looked her in the eye. He'd spoken to her father, man to man, his words low and final. Coins, heavy and cold, had been pressed into her father's palm. Her mother had wept silently in the corner, her face a mask of shame and sorrow. But she had done nothing to stop it. Eliza was sold, property. A bride for a man named Hank, whose name was whispered with a mixture of fear and grudging respect across 3 counties. A man known for his vast cattle herds and a temper as violent and unpredictable as a summer thunderstorm. The journey to his ranch was a slow, grinding torment. She was escorted by 3 of his men, rough-hewn figures who seemed carved from the same harsh landscape they traversed. Their names were Jebediah, Silas, and Cole. They spoke little to her, their gazes lingering on her with a possessive, unsettling familiarity. They saw not a girl, but a consignment, a piece of livestock being delivered to their master. During the day, the relentless jolting of the wagon and the oppressive heat were her main companions. But at night, huddled by the crackling campfire under a blanket of indifferent stars, her fear took on a more tangible form. On the first night of their journey, she lay shivering in the back of the wagon, pretending to be asleep. The thin canvas walls did little to muffle the men's voices as they sat by the fire, passing a bottle of whiskey between them. Their laughter was a low, guttural sound, like stones grinding together. "Hank's gonna be pleased," Jebediah grunted, his voice thick with liquor. "She's a pretty little thing, unbroken." A cruel chuckle came from Silas. "Won't be for long. Hank likes to do the breaking in himself. Remember that last one? The one from St. Louis?" "Barely recognized her after a month," Cole added, and the men laughed again. "This one's got fire in her eyes. Though I saw it. He likes that, likes to stamp it out." Eliza pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle a sob. They were talking about her wedding night, about the man who now legally owned her. The words they used: unbroken, breaking in, stamp it out, were terms for wild horses, not for a person. A cold dread, far more chilling than the night air, seeped into her bones. She wasn't going to a marriage. She was being led to a slaughter. The image of a future under Hank's hand, a future of being extinguished piece by piece, was more terrifying than any death she could imagine. Right then, in the suffocating darkness of the wagon, a decision took root in her heart. She would not be delivered. She would run. She waited until the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the sound of heavy snoring replaced the men's coarse talk. Every nerve in her body screamed with tension as she slowly, silently, eased her way over the wagon's tailgate. Her bare feet touched the cold, dusty ground. For a moment, she froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence of the plains pressed in on her. Taking a deep breath, she turned and fled. Not towards the trail they had come from, but into the tangled, thorny wilderness that bordered their camp. The forest was a maze of menacing shapes and deep shadows, branches like skeletal fingers, clawed at her thin cotton dress and tore at her skin. The ground was uneven, a treacherous landscape of roots and rocks that bruised her feet. Behind her, she could already hear the first shouts of alarm. Panic gave her speed. She ran blindly, fueled by pure terror, tears streaming down her face and mingling with the dust and blood. The moon, a sliver of bone-white light, offered little guidance. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, the crashing of bodies through the undergrowth, the angry, profane shouts of the men. "Get back here, you little fool!" Jebediah's voice boomed through the trees. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her legs trembling with exhaustion. A gnarled root snagged her ankle, and she went down hard. The air knocked from her chest. She lay there for a second, gasping, the taste of dirt and despair in her mouth. This was it. They would catch her. They would drag her back, and whatever Hank had in store for her would be 10 times worse. But then, through the trees, she saw it, a tiny, flickering pinprick of yellow light. It was faint, almost lost in the oppressive darkness, but it was there. A cabin, a camp. It didn't matter. It was a chance. Scrambling back to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her ankle, she stumbled toward the light. She broke through the last line of trees into a small, secluded clearing. There, a modest log cabin stood, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A single lantern cast a warm, golden pool of light onto a man sitting on a stump, his back to her. He was hunched over, his hands busy with a piece of leather. A lone horse stood tethered nearby, occasionally twitching its ears. The scene was so peaceful, so utterly removed from the violent chaos chasing her, that it felt like a dream. Just as she took a hesitant step into the clearing, the sounds of her pursuers exploded from the woods behind her. Jebediah and Silas burst into the open, their faces contorted with rage. "There you are," Silas snarled, lunging for her. A choked scream escaped Eliza's lips. She spun around and scrambled away, her injured ankle giving way. She fell forward, right into the circle of lantern light, her hands landing on the hard-packed dirt at the stranger's feet. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, just as he slowly raised his head. His face was weathered, carved with lines that spoke of sun and sorrow. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, held a deep, weary sadness. He was not old, perhaps 30, but he looked like a man who had lived several lifetimes. He was John, though she didn't know his name. A man who had sought solitude in this forgotten corner of the world after fire had stolen his wife and daughter, leaving him with nothing but ashes and a silence in his heart that no amount of time could fill. He looked from her terrified face to the 2 menacing figures advancing on her. He didn't move, didn't speak, simply watched. "That's our property," Jebediah said, pointing a grubby finger at Eliza. "Step aside. Stranger, this ain't your business." Silas grabbed Eliza's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. He started to haul her to her feet. "Come on. You're gonna get what you deserve." The touch, the threat, the girl's silent, pleading eyes. It was as if a switch was flipped deep inside the quiet man. The weariness in his face vanished, replaced by something cold and hard. He moved with a speed that was shocking in its suddenness, rising from the stump in one fluid motion. He wasn't a large man, but he seemed to grow in stature, his presence filling the clearing and pushing back the darkness. The air crackled with a sudden, dangerous energy. He fixed his gaze on the hand gripping Eliza's arm. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a low, guttural roar that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath him. It was a sound of pure, undiluted rage. The sound of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. "Don't hurt that girl!" The words ripped through the night, sharp and absolute as a rifle shot. They were not a request. They were a command, a law. Silas froze, his hand still on Eliza's arm. Jebediah stopped in his tracks. They stared at the lone cowboy, at the storm gathering in his ice-blue eyes. In that moment, they didn't see a simple homesteader. They saw something primal, a man standing on the precipice of violence, and they knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that they had crossed a line. The entire world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. John's voice hung in the frigid air, not as a sound, but as a physical force. It pinned Silas and Jebediah in place more effectively than any wall. Silas's hand, which had been clamped on Eliza's arm, recoiled as if he'd touched a hot skillet. They both took a half-step back, their bravado evaporating into the cold night. John took a deliberate step forward, moving from the lantern's glow into the shadows so that his face was obscured, leaving only his silhouette, a figure of uncompromising stillness. "You're on my land," he stated, his voice now low and flat, stripped of the earlier rage but carrying an even more menacing finality. "Get off." Jebediah, the bigger of the two, tried to muster some of his earlier bluster. "Now hold on. We ain't got no quarrel with you, mister. That girl belongs to Mr. Hank. She's his legal bride-to-be, and we're just taking her back." As he spoke, a flicker of recognition crossed Cole's face, who had been lingering at the edge of the clearing. His eyes widened slightly. He'd heard tales in a saloon 2 towns over, stories of a quiet man living out past the Red Creek Fork. A man who'd once been a tracker, a scout. Some even said a lawman, before something broke him. They said he'd been fast with a gun, unnaturally so. They said he'd killed 3 men in a dusty street in Kansas over an insult to his wife's honor, and had done so before the 3rd man had even cleared his holster. The stories were old, likely exaggerated, but looking at the man standing before them, Cole suddenly believed every word. He tugged on Jebediah's sleeve. "Jeb, let's go!" "What?" Jebediah spat, shaking him off. "We ain't leaving her." "That's John," Cole whispered urgently, his voice strained. "John Gideon." The name meant nothing to Jebediah, but the sheer terror in Cole's voice was persuasive. John took another slow step toward them. He hadn't drawn a weapon. He hadn't needed to. The promise of violence was coiled in his stance, in the set of his shoulders. It was the calm of a man who knew exactly how much damage he could do and was moments away from deciding to do it. "I'll say it one last time," John said, his voice a low rumble. "Leave." He gently placed a hand on Eliza's shoulder and guided her behind him, creating an uncrossable line with his own body. That simple, protective gesture was the final straw. Jebediah looked from John's unreadable face to Cole's pale one and made his decision. "This ain't over," he snarled, though his threat lacked conviction. "Hank will hear about this. He'll come for her, and for you." John said nothing. He simply watched as they backed away, melting back into the blackness of the forest from which they had come. The sounds of their clumsy retreat faded, leaving behind only the chirping of crickets and the soft sigh of the wind through the pines. The clearing was silent again. Only then did John turn to the girl. She was trembling uncontrollably, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her dress in tatters. He gently guided her toward the cabin door. "You're safe now." Inside, the cabin was a single room, austere and meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire casting dancing shadows. A narrow cot was pushed against the far wall. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the center, and shelves holding a few tins, a bag of flour, and a handful of books were neatly arranged. It was the home of a man who possessed little and needed less. The warmth of the room enveloped Eliza, and with the heat came the full, crushing weight of her ordeal. The dam of her composure, held together by sheer terror, finally broke. A shuddering sob escaped her. Then another. She didn't wail or scream. She cried with the silent, hopeless exhaustion of a hunted animal that has finally found a moment's reprieve. The tears simply poured from her eyes as she stood shaking in the middle of the floor. John moved with a quiet efficiency. He didn't try to comfort her with words he didn't have. He stoked the fire, adding another log until the flames leaped higher. He ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup and held it out to her. She took it with trembling hands, spilling half of it before she could bring it to her lips. When she finished, he took the cup and draped a thick wool blanket over her shoulders. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. "You can have the chair by the fire," he said, his voice softer than she would have thought possible. "It's the warmest spot." She nodded, numbly, unable to speak, and allowed herself to sink into the worn armchair he indicated. The heat from the hearth began to seep into her chilled bones, and the heavy blanket felt like a shield. She watched him through her tears as he moved back to his stump just outside the open door, picked up the piece of saddle leather and his awl, and resumed his work as if chasing off armed men were a nightly occurrence. He was giving her space, a silence to fall apart in, and it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. Curled in the chair, wrapped in his blanket, Eliza finally let sleep claim her, a dreamless blackness born of pure exhaustion. She awoke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Morning light streamed through the single window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The fire was crackling merrily, and John was standing with his back to her, tending a skillet on the hearth. He had already been outside, his boots were dusty, and the water bucket by the door was full. He seemed to sense she was awake without turning around. "There's coffee," he said, gesturing with his head toward a tin pot near the fire. "And food. Soon." Her body ached. Scratches on her arms and legs stung, and her ankle throbbed. But the fear, the all-consuming terror of the night before, had receded, leaving behind a dull, hollow ache. She poured herself a cup of the strong, black coffee, her hands still unsteady. He served the bacon and a piece of hardtack onto a tin plate and set it on the table, then sat opposite her with his own. They ate in silence. The quiet wasn't awkward. It was solid, a part of the cabin's very structure, as natural as the log walls. When they were finished, he finally looked at her directly, his blue eyes searching her face. "Where are you from, girl? Who are you running from?" Eliza's throat tightened. The thought of her parents, of the transaction that had led her here, brought a fresh wave of shame. The name Hank was a curse she couldn't bring herself to speak aloud. To tell him the truth would be to admit she was sold property, a thing with a price. She looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "I can't go back," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Please, don't make me go back." She risked a glance at him, expecting to see suspicion or perhaps annoyance at the trouble she had brought to his door. Instead, his expression was unreadable, but there was no hardness in it. He seemed to understand that her past was a wound too raw to touch. He gave a slow, single nod. "All right," he said. And that was that. The subject was closed. The first few days passed in a strange, silent dance. A wide chasm of unspoken questions and unknown histories lay between them. Yet they began to construct a fragile bridge of routine. Eliza kept to the cabin, cleaning the small space with a fervor born of gratitude and a desperate need to be useful. She swept the wooden floors, washed their 2 tin plates, and tried to make sense of his meager pantry. John was gone from sunup to sundown, tending to his horse, checking trap lines, or simply disappearing into the vast, rolling plains that surrounded his homestead. His world was a stark, lonely sort of beautiful. The small cabin was an island in a sea of wild grass that whispered and hissed in the ceaseless wind. The wind was a constant companion, moaning through the cracks in the log walls at night, a mournful, wild sound. In the mornings, She would sometimes find the tracks of a wolf or a coyote in the soft dirt near the small horse corral, a reminder of the untamed life that pressed in on all sides. She was astonished by his self-sufficiency. Behind the cabin was a small, protected vegetable patch where he grew beans, potatoes, and corn. He had a hen house with 3 chickens that provided a few precious eggs. He was a man who took nothing from the world that he didn't need and wasted nothing that he had. He lived a life pared down to its barest essentials: shelter, food, work, and a profound, bone-deep solitude. Slowly, timidly, a new dynamic began to form. It wasn't built on conversation, but on small, shared moments. One afternoon, he returned to find she had used the last of the flour to bake a lopsided, slightly burnt loaf of bread. He didn't comment on its appearance, but he ate a slice with his stew that evening and grunted. "It's good," a compliment that made her cheeks flush with pleasure. Another day. She was mending a tear in her dress with a needle and thread she found in his small supply box when her fingers fumbled. He took it from her without a word, and with his large, calloused hands, he stitched the seam with a neatness and precision that surprised her. Their awareness of each other grew in these silences. It was in the way she would watch him from the cabin door as he groomed his horse, admiring the quiet, confident way he moved. It was in the way he would sometimes pause in his work and find his gaze drawn to the cabin, where she might be hanging a washed shirt on a line. A flicker of something undefined would pass between them, a glance held for a beat too long across the dinner table, a moment when they reached for the same water dipper and their fingers brushed, sending a jolt of unexpected warmth through them both. They were 2 solitary souls, orbiting each other in the vast emptiness of the prairie, the distance between them slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to shrink. A week bled into another, and a quiet rhythm settled over the small homestead. The days were marked by the sun's journey across the vast, empty sky, and the nights by the profound silence of the prairie. Eliza had found a semblance of peace in the routine of chores, in the simple, repetitive tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind from dwelling on the past or the uncertain future. John remained a man of few words, but his presence was a steady, comforting anchor. The wall of silence between them was no longer a barrier, but a shared space, a language of its own. One evening, after they had finished their meager supper of dried jerky and beans, John went out to tend to his horse, as he always did. Eliza was inside, washing their 2 plates, when she heard a sound that cut through the gentle night breeze. It wasn't the cry of a coyote or the stamp of a hoof. It was a human sound, choked and raw, a sound of such deep, private agony that it made the hair on her arms stand up. It came from behind the small corral. After a moment of hesitation, a strange pull of concern overriding her instinct to respect his privacy, she quietly pushed the cabin door open and slipped outside. The moon was nearly full, bathing the clearing in a soft, silvery light. She moved silently, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. As she rounded the corner of the corral, she saw him. John was kneeling on the ground, his broad back to her, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Before him was a small, unassuming mound of earth, marked only by a single flat stone. In his hand, he held a flickering tallow candle, its small flame dancing in the darkness, casting a wavering golden light on his grief-stricken face. She froze, feeling like an intruder on a sacred rite. She should have turned back, left him to his sorrow, but her feet were rooted to the spot. He seemed to sense her presence, his body stiffening. He didn't turn around immediately, but took a long, shuddering breath, wiping a hand across his face before slowly rising to his feet. "You should be inside," he said, his voice thick and raspy. He didn't sound angry, only weary.
"I heard,"
she began, her own voice a whisper.
"I was worried."
He finally turned to face her. In the moonlight, she could see the tracks of tears on his dusty cheeks. His usual stoicism was gone, leaving his face open and vulnerable. His gaze fell upon the small, unmarked grave. "Her name was Sarah," he said, the words seeming to be torn from his throat. "And the little one, Lily, she was 4. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and fragile. Eliza could only stare, her heart aching for this broken man. "My wife and daughter," he clarified, as if she might not have understood. He knelt again, his calloused fingers gently tracing the edge of the stone. "It was a fire, 5 years ago, a prairie fire, came out of nowhere, fanned by a devil wind. I was in town, getting supplies. By the time I saw the smoke and got back, it was too late. The whole cabin, everything, gone. All I found was—" He choked on the words, unable to finish. "I should have been here. I should have protected them. A man's supposed to protect his family." The guilt in his voice was a raw, living thing. He wasn't just mourning their loss, he was carrying the weight of it, a penance he had sentenced himself to for a crime he didn't commit. Eliza moved closer, the space between them shrinking until she was standing beside him. She said nothing, knowing that no words could possibly soothe a wound so deep. Instead, she simply stood with him in the vast, silent cathedral of the night, sharing his vigil under the watch of 1,000,000 distant stars. They sat there for a long time, side by side on the cool earth, the candle burning down between them. He spoke in fragments, telling her about Sarah's laugh, about the way Lily used to chase butterflies in the meadow. He spoke of the life that had once filled this lonely place, painting a picture of a happiness so complete that its absence was a tangible, crushing force. Eliza listened, her own history of being unwanted and discarded feeling small in the face of his catastrophic loss. In sharing his pain, he had given her a strange gift, a context for her own sorrow, a sense that she was not the only soul adrift in this harsh land. Impulsively, driven by a wave of empathy so powerful it felt like her own grief, she reached out and laid her hand gently on his. His skin was rough and calloused, a map of hard labor, but beneath it she could feel a tremor run through him. For a moment, he allowed the contact, his hand resting in hers. Then, as if suddenly realizing the intimacy of the gesture, he flinched and pulled his hand away, clenching it into a fist at his side. He looked down, a flush of what seemed like shame on his face. He was a man so accustomed to his pain that a simple touch of kindness felt like a betrayal of it. But the moment had happened. The touch, though brief, had been a bridge across the chasm of their loneliness. When they finally rose and walked back to the cabin, the space between them no longer felt empty. Something had been broken open, and something new had been planted in its place. The next morning, the world felt different. The air was clearer, the light brighter. The oppressive weight that had hung in the cabin was gone. After their silent breakfast, John did something he had never done before. "Get your coat," he said. "We're going for a ride." He saddled his horse, then helped her up behind him. It was the first time she had left the clearing since the night she arrived. He guided the horse eastward, towards a line of cottonwood trees that marked a hidden creek. As they rode, he pointed out landmarks, explaining how to navigate by the sun, how to spot the subtle signs of a water source in the arid landscape. He was teaching her, entrusting her with the knowledge he used to survive. They reached a small, bubbling stream, its water clear and cool. The banks were surprisingly green, dotted with hardy wildflowers. The sun was warm on their shoulders, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The beauty of the place stood in stark contrast to the darkness they had shared the night before. It was as if nature itself were offering a promise of hope, a testament to the fact that even in the driest, harshest of lands, life could and did flourish. John dismounted and reached into his saddlebag, pulling out an old, heavy Colt revolver. He held it out to her. "You need to know how to use this." Eliza looked at the weapon, her eyes wide. She had never held a gun in her life. "I can't always be there," he said simply, his gaze steady and serious. "You need to be able to protect yourself." He spent the next hour teaching her. He showed her how to hold it, how to aim, how to control her breathing. His hands were patient and gentle as he adjusted her stance, his voice calm as he instructed her. When she finally pulled the trigger, the explosive sound made her jump, but the bullet hit the trunk of a dead tree not far from where he had told her to aim. A small, fierce surge of pride went through her. He was giving her more than a weapon. He was giving her a piece of her own power back. They were heading back to the cabin when the sky began to change. The brilliant blue was swiftly consumed by dark, bruised-looking clouds that rolled in from the west. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. By the time they reached the clearing, the first heavy drops were beginning to fall. They rushed inside just as the heavens opened up, a torrential downpour that hammered against the roof and turned the world outside into a gray, blurry torrent. The temperature plummeted, cold and soaked from the ride. They shivered in the sudden chill of the cabin. John immediately set to building up the fire, his movements quick and efficient. Eliza huddled near the hearth, wrapping her arms around herself, unable to stop the chattering of her teeth. The fire roared to life, but the deep-seated cold remained. John looked at her, then turned and walked to a wooden chest at the foot of his cot. He opened it and pulled out a heavy, fleece-lined coat made of thick hide, his only one. Without a word, he walked over and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy and large on her small frame, and it smelled of him, of leather, wood smoke, and the clean scent of the prairie. The warmth was immediate, seeping deep into her bones. She looked up at him, her eyes meeting his in the flickering firelight. He stood there in just his thin shirt, giving her his only real protection against the cold. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything. In the warmth of the fire, wrapped in the shelter of his coat, Eliza knew that the last of the distance between them had finally washed away in the storm. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of damp earth and sage. In the days that followed, the prairie bloomed with a fierce, short-lived beauty. The grasses, nourished by the rain, seemed to glow from within, and the sky was a dome of impossible blue. The change in the landscape was mirrored by a change within the small cabin. The last remnants of caution between John and Eliza had been swept away, replaced by a quiet, comfortable intimacy. They spoke more, sharing small stories of their pasts, not the deep, wounding tragedies, but the simple memories that made them who they were. He told her about a favorite horse he'd had as a boy. She described the feel of the cool stream she used to play in as a child. They were filling in the empty spaces, building a shared history of one small confidence at a time. One afternoon, they finished their chores early. The sun was beginning its slow descent, and the light softened, turning the world to gold. John was leaning against the corral fence, watching the horizon, and Eliza came to stand beside him. They stood in comfortable silence, a habit that had become as natural as breathing. The prairie before them was a vast, rippling ocean of golden grass, set ablaze by the dying sun. The beauty of it was so immense, so absolute, it made the heart ache. For Eliza, it was a moment of perfect, crystalline clarity. Everything she had run from, the fear, the degradation, the crushing certainty that her life was not her own, felt a world away. Here, in this quiet, forgotten place, next to this quiet, solitary man, she felt something she had never known, a sense of belonging. She felt safe, not just from the threats of the world, but safe within her own skin. The future was still a blank, terrifying map, but for the first time, she didn't feel she had to face it alone. She turned to look at him. The golden light caught the lines on his face, softening their sorrowful cast, and illuminated the quiet strength in his blue eyes. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was her sanctuary. The words came from a place deeper than thought, a simple, desperate truth that rose from the very core of her being.
I want you to keep me,
she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost carried away by the breeze. She looked down at the weathered top rail of the fence, unable to hold his gaze. Forever. John turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched out, thick with unspoken emotion. Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. Perhaps she had presumed too much. Perhaps she had mistaken his kindness for something more. And now she had shattered the fragile peace between them. But when he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough murmur, thick with a feeling he had long since buried.
Eliza,
he said, and it was the first time he had used her name. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her chin, tilting her face up to his. The sadness in his eyes was still there, a permanent shadow, but it was mingled with something new, something raw and vulnerable. He leaned in, and the world seemed to narrow to the small, sacred space between them. Their first kiss was not a thing of fire and passion. It was as hesitant and gentle as a prayer. His lips were chapped from the sun and wind, and they trembled slightly against hers. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of shared loneliness, of two broken souls finding a flicker of warmth in the cold. It was tentative at first, a silent question, and then, as she leaned into him, it deepened, becoming a quiet answer, a promise made without words in the fading light of the setting sun. It was a kiss that said, "Asterisk, you are not alone anymore." He led her by the hand back into the cabin. The room was dark now, save for the faint, rosy glow of the embers in the hearth. He lit a single candle on the small wooden table, and the tiny flame pushed back the shadows, enclosing them in a circle of warm, flickering light. The world outside, with all its dangers and uncertainties, ceased to exist. There was only the sound of their breathing and the soft crackle of the fire. There was a shyness between them, a reverence for the moment. This was uncharted territory for them both. For him, it was a step away from a past that had held him captive in grief for 5 long years. For her, it was the first time she had ever been with a man out of choice, out of a feeling that was blooming in her own heart, not out of a transaction or a threat. The candlelight cast a soft glow on her form as she stood before him, the heavy coat he had given her falling from her shoulders. The flickering light played over the shy curves of her body, over skin that bore the faint marks of her escape through the woods. He looked at her not with hunger, but with a kind of gentle wonder. His gaze was a balm, healing the shame she had carried for so long. He reached out, his hands tracing the line of her shoulder, his touch light and questioning. It was not the touch of a man taking what he believed was his, but of a man asking for permission to be close. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And in that moment, she gave him her trust, the most precious thing she had to offer. Their coming together was a slow, quiet discovery. It was a gentle exploration, a mapping of scars, both visible and invisible. They moved with a shared hesitancy, each afraid of breaking the fragile, sacred connection they had found. It was less an act of passion and more a process of mending. Every touch was a reassurance, every caress a stitch, mending the fractures in their lonely souls. In the quiet intimacy of the small cabin, two people who had been defined by what they had lost found something new in each other. They found solace, they found sanctuary, they found a home in the shelter of each other's arms. John woke before the dawn, as was his habit, but this morning was different. He lay still for a long time, watching Eliza sleep in the faint gray light, the wool blanket tangled around her, a profound sense of peace, a feeling he thought had died with his family, settled in his chest. Looking at her, he felt not a betrayal of his past, but a reason for a future. The silence in his heart, the vast, echoing emptiness had been filled. He slipped out of the cot as quietly as he could. He moved with a new purpose. He went to the small stack of seasoned lumber he kept behind the cabin and selected several long, straight planks. He took out his tools and began to work. The rhythmic scrape of the plane and the soft thud of the hammer were the only sounds in the still morning air. He was building a new bed, one wide enough for two. It was a simple, practical task, but it was also a declaration. It was the work of a man building a life. As he worked, he made a plan. He would take her into town. He would buy her a proper dress, some flour and sugar, maybe even a ribbon for her hair. He would find the preacher. Inside, Eliza awoke to the sounds of his work. She stretched, a smile touching her lips before she was even fully conscious. She felt different, lighter. She slid out of the cot and caught her reflection in the small, cracked piece of looking glass that hung by the door. For weeks, she had avoided her own gaze, seeing only a frightened, haunted girl. But the face that looked back at her this morning was not the same. Her eyes were clear, and for the first time since she could remember, they were not shadowed by fear. A genuine, unforced smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a woman who knew, with bone-deep certainty, that she was loved. It was the smile of a woman who was finally home. She was still looking at her reflection, at this stranger who was herself, when a new sound broke the morning's peace. It was distant at first, a low rumble, but it grew steadily louder. It was the unmistakable thunder of approaching horses, and there were more than one. A knot of ice formed in her stomach. She rushed to the door and peered out. John had stopped his work, standing perfectly still, saw in hand, his head cocked to the side as he listened. She followed his gaze to the horizon. 3 figures on horseback were cresting the low rise to the east, their dark shapes silhouetted against the bright morning sun. They were riding hard, directly for the cabin. John's face became a mask of cold fury. He dropped the saw and strode towards the cabin, his hand instinctively going to the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. "Get inside," he commanded, his voice a low growl. As the riders drew closer, their identities became terrifyingly clear. The man in the lead was large and imposing, even from a distance. And the 2 men flanking him, she recognized them instantly. It was Jebediah and Silas. And the man they followed could only be one person. Hank. He had come for his property. The fragile peace of their new world was about to be shattered. The morning's promise shattered into 1,000 pieces with the arrival of the 3 riders. They thundered into the clearing and reined their horses to a skidding halt, churning up the dust and trampling the fragile peace. The man in the center, Hank, was even more imposing up close. He was a bull of a man with a thick neck and a florid face, his expensive clothes stained with the grime of the trail. His eyes, small and hard like pebbles, swept over the clearing, the half-finished bed, the tidy cabin before they settled on Eliza, who stood frozen in the doorway. It was the look of a rancher assessing a piece of stray livestock. "Well, well," Hank boomed, his voice oozing a proprietary arrogance. "Found your way to a little love nest, did you? I have to admit, you've got more spirit than I gave you credit for." He swung his leg over his horse, landing on the ground with a heavy thud. He held up a folded piece of paper. "This here is a contract, signed and paid for. It says this girl belongs to me. You," he said, turning his dismissive gaze to John, "are harboring a thief in my property. Hand her over, and I might just let you walk away from this with most of your teeth." John stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Hank and the cabin door, shielding Eliza with his body. His hand rested loosely on the butt of his Colt, his face a mask of cold, unyielding resolve. "She's not property," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And she's not going anywhere with you." A dark smile twisted Hank's lips. "Brave words. Homesteader." He gestured to Jebediah and Silas, who were already dismounting, their hands hovering near their own pistols. "But there are 3 of us. You do the math." John knew the calculation all too well. He might be fast enough to take one, maybe even 2 of them, but not all 3 before they put a bullet in him. Or worse. In Eliza, a direct fight was a losing battle. There was only one choice. "Eliza!" he called over his shoulder, his eyes never leaving Hank. "My horse! Now!" Understanding dawned in her eyes. While Hank and his men were focused on John, she slipped back into the shadows of the cabin. A moment later, she emerged leading John's steady roan from the corral. In one fluid, desperate motion. John spun around, grabbed Eliza's waist, and threw her onto the horse's back. He vaulted up behind her, seized the reins, and kicked his heels into the animal's flanks. The horse lunged forward, not towards the open plains where they would be easily run down, but towards the steep, rocky incline of the mountains that rose up behind the homestead. It was their only chance, a terrain where horses would be a hindrance, not a help. "After them!" Hank roared, his face turning purple with rage. The chase was a frantic, punishing scramble. John pushed his horse as hard as he dared up the winding game trails, the animal's lungs heaving, its hooves striking sparks on the flinty rock. Bullets whizzed past them, smacking into trees and whining off stones. They abandoned the horse when the path grew too steep, continuing their flight on foot. They plunged into a labyrinth of red rock canyons and jagged peaks, a desolate landscape that offered both cover and 1,000 different ways to die. The journey became a waking nightmare. The sun beat down on them, reflecting off the crimson stone until the heat was a physical blow. A great, hot wind rose up, a relentless force that stole the moisture from their mouths and tried to peel them from the cliff faces. Their water was gone by the end of the first day, and a desperate, agonizing thirst set in. Their lips cracked, and their tongues felt thick and swollen in their mouths. The land itself was hostile. Every shadow could hide a coiled rattlesnake. Every rock could shelter a scorpion. On the second day, exhaustion and dehydration began to take their toll. They were traversing a narrow ledge, a sheer drop on one side, when the loose scree under Eliza's feet gave way. She cried out as she lost her footing, her fingers scrabbling for a hold on the rock face as her body slid towards the abyss. John, just ahead of her, spun around with a speed born of pure terror. He lunged, his fingers clamping around her wrist just as her feet slipped off the edge. He grunted with the strain, his muscles screaming as he held her entire weight, the wind trying to tear her from his grasp. For a heart-stopping moment, they hung there, suspended between life and death. With a great, roaring effort, he hauled her back onto the ledge. She collapsed against him, sobbing, both of them trembling too violently to stand. They stumbled on, their flight now a slow, agonizing crawl. Just as dusk began to settle, painting the canyons in deep shades of purple and orange, John spotted it, a dark opening in the rock, a shallow cave carved by wind and time, likely used by native tribes for centuries. It was a shelter. With the last of their strength, they scrambled inside and collapsed onto the sandy floor. The cave was small, barely more than a hollow in the rock, but it shielded them from the relentless wind. As the temperature on the mountain plummeted with the setting sun, a deep chill set in. They huddled together in the darkness for warmth, two exhausted figures pressed against each other, in the close, confined space. Their breaths mingled, their heartbeats seeming to fall into the same ragged rhythm. Eliza rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady thud of his heart. The terror of her near fall still echoed through her body. She thought of how he had thrown himself between her and Hank, how he had fought to save her on the cliff edge. He was risking everything for her, a girl he barely knew, a girl who had brought nothing but violence to his door. "If you die because of me," she whispered into the darkness, her voice choked with emotion, "I will never forgive myself." He was silent for a long moment. His arms tightened around her, pulling her impossibly closer. When he spoke, his voice was a rough, raw murmur against her hair. "Without you, Eliza," he said, the words stripped bare of everything but the honest truth, "I'd have no reason to be living at all." His words were a revelation. He wasn't just saving her, she was saving him. She had given him a reason to fight again, a reason to live beyond the ghosts of his past, in the face of death, pressed together in the ancient darkness. The love that had bloomed between them in quiet moments now ignited with a desperate, fierce intensity. She lifted her head, and his mouth found hers in the dark. This time, there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of raw, desperate need, a claiming. It was an affirmation of life against the encroaching darkness, a defiant cry that they were still here, still breathing, still together, in the cold, stone sanctuary of the cave. They came together not with the gentle reverence of their first night, but with a wild, passionate urgency. It was a silent vow made in the heart of the unforgiving mountains, a promise that if this was to be their last night on earth, they would face it as one, their souls irrevocably intertwined. The harsh light of morning brought with it a harsher reality. The fire of the night had receded, leaving behind a cold, gray ash. Eliza was burning with fever. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, and a tremor ran through her body that had nothing to do with the morning chill. The journey, the lack of water, the terror, it had all been too much. She was too weak to move, her words a delirious mumble. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through John's exhaustion. They couldn't stay here. They had no food, no water, and Eliza needed medicine, a real bed, a doctor. But they couldn't run either. She was in no condition to even stand, let alone climb down a mountain. He was trapped. There was only one terrible option. He had to go down alone, find a town, any town, and get help. It was a desperate gamble. He would be exposed, and Hank and his men were surely still out there, hunting for them. But looking at Eliza's fever-bright eyes, he knew it was no choice at all. "I'll be back," he whispered, pressing his lips to her hot forehead. "I promise. Eliza, just hold on." He left her curled in the relative safety of the cave and began his perilous descent. He moved with as much stealth as he could, his body screaming with thirst and exhaustion. He was halfway down a rocky slope, his eyes scanning the plains below for any sign of a settlement, when a voice cut through the air. "There he is!" John's head snapped up. On a ridge above him stood Silas, a rifle in his hands. Before he could react, Jebediah emerged from a cluster of rocks to his left. He had walked right into their trap. He drew his Colt, but he was too slow, his movements clumsy with dehydration and fatigue. A rock, thrown by Jebediah, struck his gun hand, sending the pistol clattering onto the stones. He lunged for it, but Silas was already on him. He fought with the last of his strength, a cornered animal, but he was outnumbered and outmatched. A heavy blow from a pistol butt connected with the side of his head. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain, and then everything went black as he crumpled to the ground. John's world returned as a symphony of pain. A throbbing agony pulsed in his head, and his wrists burned from the rough rope that bound them. He was slung over the back of a horse like a sack of grain, the rhythmic jolting sending fresh waves of nausea and pain through his battered body. He could hear the triumphant, jeering voices of Jebediah and Silas, and the low, satisfied rumble of Hank's voice. They were taking him back, not to his secluded homestead, but to the nearest settlement, a dusty, wind-beaten town ironically named Redemption. They made a spectacle of his arrival. Hank paraded him down the town's single, muddy street, loudly proclaiming his version of events to the curious onlookers who emerged from the saloon and the general store. "Here's the man," Hank bellowed, pointing at the half-conscious John. "A kidnapper and a thief. Snuck onto my land and stole my intended bride right from under my nose." The townspeople, hard-faced men and weary women, stared, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. In a place like Redemption, a man's property and a man's honor were everything. An accusation of stealing another man's betrothed was as serious as horse theft. John was dragged from the horse and thrown into a small, stiflingly hot cell at the back of the sheriff's office. the iron door clanging shut with a sound of absolute finality. He was no longer just a man. He was a villain in a story Hank had already told the entire town. High in the mountains, Eliza awoke from a fevered dream to a profound and terrifying silence. The cave was cold, and the spot beside her, where John's warmth had been a comfort through the night, was empty. A primal fear, sharp and icy, shot through her. "John," she called out, her voice a weak, scratchy thing. The only answer was the mournful sigh of the wind outside the cave's mouth. She knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that he had gone for help and that he had been caught. The thought of him captured, hurt, and paying the price for her freedom was a torment far worse than any fever. The weakness in her limbs, the dizzying throb in her head, it all seemed to retreat, burned away by a new, desperate fire. She could not lie here and wait for a fate decided by others. The girl who had run blindly into the forest was gone. In her place was a woman who had been shown kindness, who had been taught to shoot, who had been loved. She would not let that be for nothing. Her journey down the mountain was a brutal ordeal. Every step sent a jarring pain through her body. She was weak, dizzy, and her throat was a desert of thirst. She stumbled and fell. Her hands and knees scraped raw on the sharp rocks, but she always got back up. The image of John's face, the memory of his quiet strength, was a talisman against the pain. It was his voice she heard in her mind. Asterisk, you need to be able to protect yourself. She finally reached the plains and saw the huddle of buildings that was the town of Redemption. She limped down the main street, a wild, disheveled figure in a torn dress, her hair matted with dirt and leaves. The stairs she drew were cold and suspicious. She heard the whispers, the fragments of Hank's story. The girl he stole, flighty little thing, no better than she ought to be. They were talking about her. They had already judged her, and by extension, they had already condemned John. Desperate, she looked for a place of sanctuary, a place where someone might listen. Her eyes fell on the simple wooden cross atop a small, whitewashed church at the end of the street. With the last of her strength, she pushed open the heavy door and collapsed onto the cool stone floor inside. A priest, a middle-aged man with kind, tired eyes named Father Michael, rushed to her side. He helped her to a pew and brought her a dipper of water, which she drank with a desperate thirst, between gasping breaths. She told him everything, the truth. She told him about being sold, about Hank's cruelty, about her escape, and about John's selfless protection. The priest listened patiently, his expression betraying nothing. He had seen much in his years on the frontier, and he knew that the truth was rarely as simple as the stories shouted in the street. "Rest here, my child," he said when she had finished. "You are safe within these walls." As Father Michael tended to Eliza's immediate needs, news of the runaway girl's appearance at the church spread through the small town like wildfire. It reached the ears of a woman who lived in a small, tidy house at the edge of town, a woman who rarely showed her face and kept to herself. Her name was Beatrice, and she was Hank's estranged wife, a fact that most of the town had chosen to forget. She had endured 5 years of his cruelty before finding the courage to leave him, taking nothing but her own dignity. When she heard that Hank had brought in a runaway bride, a cold, familiar dread filled her. She knew his appetites, his belief that everything and everyone could be bought and broken. She saw a reflection of her own past, and a quiet, steely resolve formed within her. That evening, under the cover of darkness, Beatrice slipped out of her house and made her way to the church. She found Eliza resting on a cot in a small room behind the apse. Beatrice looked at the young, exhausted girl and saw the same fear she herself had once known. "He did this to you, didn't he?" Beatrice asked, her voice low. Eliza could only nod. "I left him because he was a monster," Beatrice continued, her voice trembling with the memory of it. "But I was a fool. I signed a contract when I was a girl, not much older than you. My father was in his debt. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a worn, folded document. This is a copy of my own marriage contract. But I also found this. A man who worked for Hank felt guilty. He sent me a copy of the agreement your father signed. She handed a second paper to Eliza. Look at the date, and look at your birth date. Written right there. You are not of legal age. This agreement, it is not binding. He does not own you. The next day, a makeshift trial was convened in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold the crowd. The town's justice of the peace, a grim-faced man named Judge Miller, sat at a whiskey-stained table. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and prejudice. Hank stood tall and confident, a pillar of the community in the eyes of many. John was hauled in, his face bruised and swollen, his hands still bound. He was forced into a chair, where he sat, silent and defiant. Hank presented his case with blustering self-assurance, painting a picture of a virtuous man wronged by a conniving drifter and a foolish, ungrateful girl. The crowd murmured their assent. Judge Miller looked at John. Do you have anything to say for yourself, son? John's gaze didn't waver. He didn't look at the judge or the hostile crowd. He looked at Eliza, who had just entered the room, flanked by Father Michael. His eyes were all the defense he needed. They held a complete and unwavering trust. I ask that Miss Eliza speaks, John said, his voice hoarse. All eyes turned to her. She was clean now, her hair brushed, wearing a simple dress the priest had found for her. She looked young, fragile, and utterly out of place. Judge Miller sighed. Very well, let the girl have her say. Eliza stood, her hands trembling, but her voice, when it came, was clear and steady. She told the truth. She spoke of her family's poverty, of the cold transaction, of the fear she felt on the trail. She described her desperate flight, her chance meeting with John, and the kindness he had shown her. She did not raise her voice or weep. She simply told her story, her words falling into the hostile silence of the room. As she spoke, the crowd began to stir. There were whispers of disbelief, scornful snorts from some of the men. A likely story, one man muttered. She ran off with a new man, that's all. Through it all, John never took his eyes off her. His gaze was a lifeline, a silent, powerful affirmation that her words were true, that he believed in her, that he stood with her even in chains. His absolute faith gave her the strength to continue, to meet the doubting eyes of the crowd and not falter. When she finished, a heavy silence fell over the room. Judge Miller looked uncomfortable. It was a simple case of he said, she said, and in this world, the he was a wealthy landowner, and the she was a nobody. This is a touching tale, young lady, the judge said dismissively. But unless you have proof. She does. Father Michael's voice boomed from the back of the room. He stepped forward, holding the document Beatrice had given Eliza. This is the contract, mister. Hank speaks of. I ask you to note the date of the signing, and the girl's listed age, 17, in this territory. That makes this document legally worthless. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Hank's face went from confident to thunderous. This is an outrage, a forgery! Judge Miller took the paper, his eyes scanning it carefully. He was a man of the law, and the law, for all its flaws, was what separated a town from a lawless camp. He looked at Hank's sputtering rage, at the quiet dignity of the priest, at John's unwavering stare, and finally, at Eliza's terrified but hopeful face. He was a man caught between the town's most powerful citizen and the stark, black-and-white letters on a piece of paper. He hesitated, the fate of two people resting on his next words. The saloon was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Finally, he slammed his hand down on the table. The sound made everyone jump. He looked at the sheriff. Free them. The judge's two words, free them, seemed to suck all the air from the saloon. For a moment, no one moved. Hank stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief and apoplectic rage. Then, the sheriff, a man who had clearly grown weary of the whole affair, pulled a knife from his belt and, with a single, decisive motion, sawed through the ropes binding John's wrists. The cords fell away, and with them, the last of John's strength, the defiance that had held his battered body upright, the sheer force of will that had carried him through the capture and the mockery, vanished. The roar of blood in his ears drowned out the astonished gasps of the crowd. He took one unsteady step away from the chair, then another. His legs, starved and brutalized, buckled beneath him. He stumbled through the swinging doors of the saloon and out into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight of the town square. There, in the middle of the street, amidst the wagon ruts and the dust, he collapsed, his body finally surrendering to the abyss of exhaustion and pain. A collective cry went up from the crowd, but Eliza heard none of it. Seeing him fall was like watching the sun drop from the sky. The composure she had maintained throughout her testimony, the careful, steady wall she had built around her emotions, crumbled into dust. She ran from the saloon, her skirts flying, and fell to her knees in the dirt beside him. She gathered his head into her lap, her hands gently brushing the matted, bloody hair from his bruised face, and then she began to weep. It was not the silent, fearful crying of the girl who had fled into the woods. A different kind of floodgate had opened. These were racking, cleansing sobs of profound, earth-shattering relief. They were tears for his pain, for her fear, for their survival. She clung to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had tried to tear them apart, her tears falling onto his face, mingling with the dust and the dried blood. "John," she choked out, the name a broken prayer. "John!" The townspeople of Redemption, who had moments before been a hostile, judgmental mob, now stood in stunned silence. They had witnessed a public reckoning. Hank's power had been built on bluster and intimidation, and when it was stripped away by a simple piece of paper and a girl's quiet truth, all that remained was a pathetic, raging bully. He stormed out of the saloon, shouting threats that no one listened to, and rode out of town, his honor in tatters. The crowd looked at the scene in the street, the fallen man, the weeping girl, and saw not a criminal and his accomplice, but two souls who had been pushed to the very brink. A slow, profound wave of shame and sympathy washed through them. Father Michael was the first to act, his presence a calming authority. He knelt beside Eliza, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Beatrice, her face a mixture of sorrow and triumph, appeared with a canteen of water. "Let's get them out of the street," the blacksmith said, his voice gruff with an emotion he couldn't name. A wagon was brought around. Several men gently lifted John's unconscious form and laid him in the back on a bed of hay. Eliza climbed in after him, refusing to leave his side. The journey back to the homestead was a somber procession. There was no victory parade, only the quiet, creaking turn of the wagon wheels. But something fundamental had shifted. When they arrived back at the small clearing, the townspeople did not simply leave them. What happened next was a quiet miracle of the frontier. It was an unspoken, collective act of atonement. The blacksmith's wife arrived with a basket containing bread, a slab of bacon, and a jar of potent herbal salve. The general store owner, who had eyed John with suspicion just a day before, unloaded a sack of flour and another of beans from his wagon. One by one, others came. They brought quilts, firewood, a few chickens in a crate. Two men, their faces set with grim determination, picked up the tools John had dropped and, without a word, set about finishing the new, wider bed he had started, its half-finished frame a testament to a future that had almost been stolen. Their charity was a form of apology, a way of mending the social fabric they had allowed a bully to tear. For 3 days, Eliza nursed John. She cleaned his wounds, forced sips of broth and water between his lips, and sat by his side, her hand rarely leaving his He drifted in and out of consciousness, his sleep troubled by fevered dreams. On the fourth morning, she awoke in the chair beside the cot to find him watching her, his eyes clear for the first time. The fever had broken. "Eliza!" he rasped, his voice raw. Tears of relief sprang to her eyes.
I'm here,
She whispered.
I'm here.
In the week that followed, as his strength slowly returned, a deep and abiding peace settled over the homestead. The finished bed, wide and sturdy, now stood in the center of the cabin. The sounds of the townsfolk's hammers had been replaced by the familiar whisper of the wind. They were alone again, but their solitude was no longer about isolation. It was about sanctuary. One evening, they sat on the bench outside the cabin, watching the sun set, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors as it had on the day she had asked him to keep her. The air was cool and sweet. John had been quiet for a long time, turning a small object over and over in his hands. Finally, he held it out to her. It was a ring, fashioned from a simple, hammered band of silver. It was not a jeweler's creation. It was imperfect, bearing the faint marks of a file and a determined hand, but it shone with a soft, warm luster in the fading light. "It was my grandfather's," John said, his voice low and steady. "He wore it his whole life." "It's not much." He turned her hand over, his thumb gently tracing the lines on her palm. "I have nothing else to offer you, Eliza, just this land, my name, and all the days I have left." He looked up, his clear blue eyes meeting hers, holding them with a gentle, unwavering intensity. "Will you be my wife?" Eliza's heart felt as if it would burst. This wasn't a contract signed in desperation or a transaction born of poverty. This was a question asked from the heart, a promise forged in silver and hardship. She couldn't speak. She could only nod, a radiant smile breaking through her happy tears as he slipped the cool, heavy ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Father Michael came out 2 days later. Their wedding was not held in a church. It took place at the edge of the clearing, under the sprawling, ancient branches of a great oak tree that had stood sentinel over this land for 100 years. Eliza wore the simple cotton dress Beatrice had given her, and she had woven a few late-blooming wildflowers into her hair. John stood tall and straight in a clean shirt. The bruises on his face faded to pale yellow shadows. Beatrice was their only witness. Their vows were not spoken for a crowd, but whispered to each other and the ancient sky. A solemn promise to be each other's shelter, each other's home. That night, for the first time, they lay together in the new bed. The moonlight streamed through the window, bathing the small cabin in a gentle, ethereal glow. This was not the desperate, life-affirming claiming in the cave, nor the hesitant, healing discovery of their first night. This was a homecoming. There were no shadows of the past, no fears for the future, only the profound, unshakable peace of the present. They lay in each other's arms, listening to the quiet sounds of the prairie night, their bodies and souls finally at rest. Eliza traced the line of his jaw in the moonlight, her heart overflowing. She thought of the terrified girl who had run from a wagon, who had stumbled through the darkness towards a single, flickering light. She was that girl no longer.
I'm not running anymore,
she whispered, the words a quiet revelation. John gathered her closer, his lips brushing against her hair. His voice was a low, steady promise in the stillness of the room, a vow more sacred than any spoken before a priest. "And I will always stand between you and anyone who tries to make you—" The seasons turned, painting the prairie in a cycle of ochre, white, and brilliant green. The wind that had once sounded like a lament to Eliza now seemed to sing a lullaby. 1 year after the judge's verdict, the homestead was no longer a place of just survival and solitude. It was a place of life. The most profound change was not the sturdy new roof on the cabin or the expanded corral, but the sound of a baby's laughter that now mingled with the rustle of the wind in the tall grass. They had a son, a boy with his father's steady blue eyes and a shock of his mother's dark hair. They named him Samuel, a strong, simple name for a boy born of a strong, simple love. His presence had completed the mending of their world. He was the living, breathing embodiment of their future, a testament to the life they had forged from the ashes of their pasts. Their days fell into a rhythm as old as the land itself. John worked from sunup to sundown, his quiet, powerful presence a constant anchor. He broke moorland for a larger hayfield, his muscles straining as he turned the stubborn earth. He expanded his small herd of horses, his gentle hand and quiet voice making him a natural master of the animals. His work was no longer a solitary penance to keep the ghosts at bay. It was the joyful labor of a man building a legacy for his son. Eliza's life was woven into the fabric of the homestead. She was no longer the haunted girl who had stumbled into the clearing. She was a wife and a mother, her hands skilled at baking bread, tending a garden, and mending small clothes. But the strength John had unlocked in her remained. She was as comfortable with a rifle in her hands as she was with her son on her hip, her eyes ever watchful, a guardian of the peace they had fought so hard to win. Their relationship with the town of Redemption had undergone a sea change. The suspicion and judgment had been replaced by a deep, abiding respect. When they rode into town for supplies, they were greeted with friendly nods and genuine smiles. The blacksmith would call out a greeting to John, asking his opinion on a new horse. The women would gather around Eliza at the general store, cooing over baby Samuel and pressing small gifts of jam or a brightly colored ribbon into her hands. They no longer whispered about her as the runaway girl. A new name had taken root, a name spoken with a kind of gentle reverence. They called her the bride saved by love. Her story, and John's, had become a local legend, a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and a hopeful testament to the power of courage and kindness. They were a reminder to the hard-bitten people of the frontier that even in the most unforgiving of lands, goodness could still take root and flourish. News of Hank came 6 months after the trial. A traveling marshal, stopping at their homestead for water, brought the tale. Hank's empire, built on intimidation and crooked deals, had crumbled. After the public humiliation in Redemption, his other enemies had been emboldened. He was arrested for cattle rustling and bribing a land agent. His name, once a source of fear, was now a curse. The marshal also brought an official document from the territorial capital. The marriage ledger that had borne Eliza's name had been nullified. The last chain to her past was officially broken. She was, in the eyes of the law and the world, completely and irrevocably free. With that final closure, John found a new purpose. The memory of his lost family no longer haunted him with guilt, but instead inspired a need to give back, to protect others as he had once failed to protect them. He saw the ragged orphan children who sometimes drifted through Redemption, children left behind by wagon trains or cast out by tragedy, and he saw a need he could fill. He built a small bunkhouse and a training ring at the far end of his property. He began taking in children, 2 or 3 at a time, from the church in town. He called it the Gideon Camp. It wasn't an orphanage. It was a school for survival. He taught them what he knew: how to ride, how to track, how to read the land. He taught them how to be strong, how to be self-reliant. But most importantly, he and Eliza gave them a place where they felt safe and valued. He was building a new generation, one that would be too strong to be sold, too smart to be broken. Watching him with the children, his voice patient, his hands gentle as he adjusted a young boy's grip on the reins, Eliza's heart would swell with a love so profound it was almost painful. He wasn't just her husband, he was the best man she had ever known. The story ends as it began. With a sunset, the sky was on fire. The clouds streaked with crimson and gold. The day's work was done. The orphan children had gone back to the bunkhouse for the night, their tired, happy voices fading into the evening air. Eliza stood in the doorway of their cabin, a place that was now unequivocally home. The scent of baking bread and wood smoke hung in the air. Out in the meadow, John was leading Samuel by the hand. The boy, just over a year old, took clumsy, triumphant steps through the tall grass, his small hand completely enveloped in his father's large, calloused one. John was pointing at something in the distance, a hawk circling in the vast, open sky, and even from the cabin, Eliza could hear the low, gentle rumble of his voice and the high, delighted squeal of her son's laughter. The scene was so simple, so perfect, it was like a painting. The strong, quiet man and the small, hopeful boy, walking together into a future that stretched out before them, as vast and as beautiful as the prairie itself. A gentle evening breeze stirred, catching the hem of Eliza's dress and cooling her skin. She rested a hand on the doorframe, the smooth, worn silver of her wedding ring a constant, comforting presence on her finger. She thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment, the terror, the pain, the impossible odds, and she thought of the single, defining moment that had changed the course of her entire world. The image was seared into her memory, a man rising from the shadows, his face set like stone, his voice a low, protective roar that had pushed back the darkness. It was a sound that had not only saved her from her pursuers, but had saved her from a life without hope, without choice, without love. It had saved her from disappearing. She watched as John scooped their son into his arms and settled him on his shoulders. The boy's happy shrieks echoed across the clearing as they continued their walk. Two silhouettes against the dying, glorious light. A soft, peaceful smile touched Eliza's lips, and she whispered the words to the wind, a quiet prayer of thanks to the universe. Just one word, and a whole life changed. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment below and let us know. If you enjoyed the tale, please consider subscribing to the Wild West Campfire channel and sharing your thoughts. We've got plenty more stories to tell.